Okay, so we're continuing our reading of chapter 2 of part 1 of Individuation in light of notions of form and information. I think we might be able to finish this chapter today and then we'll go on to chapter 3 next time, but we'll see how far we get. But the section or the subsection that we have been reading and that we're going to finish right now was on the absolute genesis of an individual as opposed to the relative genesis that we saw in the previous subsection. Whereas in relative genesis, you have, for example, the crystal, the sulfur in one crystalline form that can then be recrystallized into a second crystalline form. Now we're in the case of the absolute genesis, we're instead looking at the formation of a crystal out of an amorphous substance in the first place, rather than from one crystalline form to another. And then we'll see in the next subsection, he's going to discuss a little bit about what the difference is between these two, the relative and the absolute genesis. But we just have a couple paragraphs to finish in this subsection first. So I will read those two paragraphs and then we can discuss. The quite remarkable meditation that Plato delivers in the Parmenides on the rapport of being and becoming, resuming or announcing the meditation of the Philebus, cannot lead us to the discovery of a mixture of being and becoming. The dialectic remains antithetical, and the content of the Triton T cannot seem to be anything but a unsatisfying postulation. This is because Plato cannot find in Greek science the notion of a suspended becoming that is asymmetrical and immutable. The alternative between static being and the inconsistent emanation of genesis and phthora could not be avoided by the introduction of any mixture. Participation among ideas, and even among the number ideas, such as we find it in the Eponymous, or as we reconstructed based on books Mu and Nu of Aristotle's metaphysics with the theory of the Metreion, still conserves the notion of the superiority of the one and the immobile over the multiple and the moving. Becoming remains conceived as movement, and movement remains conceived as imperfection. Nevertheless, through this infinite dawn, that is Plato's thought in the decline of his life, we can search the sense for a real mixture of being and becoming, which is intuited rather than defined in the direction of ethics, to be immortalized in the sensible, and thus also in becoming. If the Timaeus were written at this moment, perhaps we would have had since the 4th century a doctrine of the mixture of being and becoming. After this effort remained fruitless, seemingly due to the esoteric nature of Plato's teaching, the philosophical meditation inspired by Plato with Speusippus and Xenocrates returns to the dualism founded by Parmenides, this founder of the thought upon which Plato authorized himself to bear a sacrilegious hand in order to say in some way and in some relation that being is not and that non-being is. The accepted separation between physics and reflexive thought has become an avowed philosophical attitude, starting with Socrates, who, disappointed by the physics of Anaxagoras, wanted to bring philosophy back from the sky to the earth. Aristotle's work certainly marks a vast encyclopedic effort, and physics is reintroduced. But this physics, deprived of mathematical formulation after the repudiation of archetype structures and preoccupied with classification more than measures, is not what can provide paradigms for reflection. The synthesis of being and becoming failed at the level of inert being, could not be solidly carried out at the level of the living being, since it would have been necessary to know the genesis of the living being, which still to this day is an object of research. Furthermore, the Western philosophical tradition is almost entirely substantialistic. It has ignored the knowledge of the real individual because it could not grasp the latter in its genesis. Whether conceived as indivisible and eternal molecule, or as richly organized living being, the individual was grasped as a given reality, useful for explaining the composition of beings or for discovering the finality of the cosmos, but not as knowable reality itself. We want to show through this work that the individual can now be an object of science, and that the opposition declared by Socrates between physics and reflexive and normative thought must finally be done away with. This turning point implies that the relativity of scientific knowledge, savoir, is no longer conceived within an empiricist doctrine. And we should note that empiricism involves the theory of induction, for which the concrete is the sensible and the real is identical to the concrete. The theory of knowledge, connaissance, must be modified down to its roots, i.e. the theory of perception and sensation. Sensation must appear as the relation of a living individual with the milieu in which it is found. However, even if the content of this relation does not initially constitute a science, it already possesses a value insofar as it is relation. The fragility of sensation stems above all from that fact that it is asked to reveal substances, something it cannot do because of its fundamental function. If there is a certain number of discontinuities between sensation and science, this is not a discontinuity like the one that exists or is supposed to exist between genera and species, but like the one that exists between different hierarchized metastable states. The presumption of empiricism, which is relative to the chosen point of departure, is only valid in a substantialistic doctrine, since this epistemology of relation can only be expounded upon by supposing the individual being as defined. It was impossible for us to indicate it before utilizing it. This is why we began our study by way of a paradigm borrowed from physics. Only later on did we derive the reflexive consequences resulting from this point of departure. This method can seem quite primitive. It is in fact similar to that of the Ionian physiologists, but it is presented here as a postulate, for it seeks to found an epistemology that would be anterior to any logic. So Alyosha asked about the bit about how being is not and non-being is. So this is a reference to Plato's Parmenides that he cites a little bit earlier. So of course, Parmenides himself, the person, his doctrine was that only being is, and it's absolutely impossible to say that that non-being is, or that being is not. And then, so in the Parmenides, it's a dialogue between Parmenides as an old man and Socrates as a young man. Although the real chronology doesn't actually work for that meeting to ever have happened. Socrates, in that dialogue, comes up with the doctrine that non-being is and being is not in a certain sense. So he is through the dialectic of all the different possible variations of those concepts that they end up with that being forced to acknowledge that in a sense non-being is and being is not, and so this at one point in the dialogue, Socrates describes this as being a parasital doctrine because Parmenides is sort of his spiritual father, and so he's killing his spiritual father by refuting his doctrine. That's what that line about the being is not and non-being is about. But here, what Simondon is pointing towards is that is the absence in Greek science of any concept like metastability, or something that would be, or the notion of a potential, something that is in some sense intermediate, or a mixture between the realm of becoming and the realm of being. So in Plato, we only have this opposition between the realm of becoming, coming to be and passing away, and then the realm of true being, which is immune to becoming. And there's this sort of this strict opposition between the two, and there's no intermediate concept or mixture or something like that, which is what Simondon characterizes as potential or metastability, as some sort of mediating concept between those two. And then he points to the Timaeus as the place within Plato about where that concept would have been the most evident, I guess you could say, or where it would make the most sense to try to insert that concept. Because so in the Timaeus, it's the whole thing is depicted. There's a sort of preface where it's depicted as being only about probability, because we can't have true knowledge of the realm of becoming. We can only have knowledge of what is in the proper sense, and not of what comes to be or passes away. So we can only have probable opinion about what becomes, and so that's sort of the preface to the whole dialogue. and then there is an account of the creation of the world by the demiurge, which is an account of becoming, in the sense that the world is coming into existence. But again, there's no use of a concept of potential or metastability or something like that, which we could instead, or we might have expected to find there, reading it sort of anachronistically, reading our own concepts back into what Plato was doing. And then there's a bit on page 87. I think this is important. Is that he specifies that because of the advances of scientific knowledge since the time of Plato and Aristotle, we can now have a scientific concept of the individual, or we can grasp the individual in its genesis in a scientific manner, so that what at the time of Plato and Aristotle, what at that time was something that was sort of a mystery, is something that can now be understood scientifically, and so that allows us to sort of reformulate our concepts on the basis of that scientific knowledge of the individual. And so I think that's an interesting depiction of Simondon's method here, because he's as we've seen, he sticks very closely to scientific results, and then he draws the conclusions from those methods, from those scientific results, yeah. So I think that's just an interesting depiction of his method.
So the reference to Aristotle, I think, is interesting. And I guess I'm trying to, so to me it seems like on one level there's actually a similarity between Simondon's project and Aristotle's project. In that I think Aristotle was also looking for a much closer relationship between being and becoming than, was there in Plato. So he was looking to overcome that dualism in some way. And I guess he does it by bringing in the relationship between potential and actuality, right? Which I think is tied to teleology and the final cause. And Simondon's criticism, of course, right, is, well, that's presupposing the individual already, right? This is not solving the problem. And it's interesting of mathematics, kind of hard. And he took biology as his starting point. And the way, a seed becomes a grown tree, that kind of thing. And I guess Simondon is saying we actually need the mathematical. And we need to conceive of individuation in some way involving mathematics. And I guess what's really interesting is how, like this idea, I think it's the idea of intensity that plays a key role here. And intensity, or this is a symmetry that we've been talking about, these multiple orders, all that kind of stuff, is all really mathematical, right? And somehow mathematics is supposed to play a kind of role here. I don't really understand that all that well. And I guess to me, it almost seems kind of almost like quasi, a little mystifying, So anyway, putting that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point about the mathematics bit in his criticism of what's insufficient in Aristotle's thought, yeah, I think it's also fair to say that Simondon doesn't really thematize mathematics. Like, he doesn't give us an account of what mathematical knowledge consists in, or how it relates to physical knowledge and so on. So that would be an area that would be worth investigating more. I think, like how mathematical knowledge fits into Simondon's thought. But yeah, I think I think the criticism is fair in the sense that we do see as a sort of just as an empirical fact about the history of science. There's the Aristotelian tradition, or as long as Aristotle was taken as sort of the model for physical knowledge, there is a de-emphasis on measurement and the use of mathematics um, as a principle for physical knowledge, and then with the sort of transformation that comes about, through the work of Galileo and others around that same time. There's at the same time an introduction of measurement and the use of mathematics in natural science, and then also a certain repudiation of Aristotle. So there's just at the sort of empirical level of the history of science, there does seem to be some sort of correlation between this lack of a mathematical basis for physical knowledge and the reference to Aristotle, and in particular, a lot of the early modern natural scientists referred to Plato as a model and looked to the Timaeus for as a sort of model of what natural science should look like. Of course, with modifications, but yeah, this is an area that I think would be worth looking into more, how mathematical knowledge fits in with Simondon's general picture of knowledge.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I guess the challenge is because the standard or one picture of mathematics that is there is mathematics deals with eternal truths that are, basically pure being. That numbers maybe are, I guess maybe it's a kind of Pythagorean view of mathematics. I'm not sure. But what's interesting here is mathematics is put to the service of knowing something like a process or this ontogenesis that Simondon is talking about, and I guess that that implies a different. Sorry, there's another. That implies a different picture of mathematics than the standard. So I'm gonna have to mute, but.
I'm kind of out of practice in a sense, catching up on readings, but I really liked and was interested in this section on sensation, and it feels like he's setting up, when he says it seeks to found an epistemology that would be anterior to any logic. Some of the discussions we've had before about what transduction is and stuff like that. But I was just wondering if anyone would be able to help, I don't know, maybe restate or kind of tease out some of the stuff he's saying here about empiricism, because I'm interested in it's like when he's saying scientific knowledge has to no longer be conceived within an empiricist doctrine, and that needing to get away from a notion of sensation being the real and the real being concrete. There's an approach to sensation there. I think he says that's about not revealing. It's not looking at sensation as though it reveals some sort of deeper substance or is like a mask of a deeper substantialism. That seems to track to me, and even reminds me of like some of the Bergson stuff we've read. But I guess I'm trying to piece it all together. I just wondered if anyone had comments on that.
I think here this is something that we'll have to come back to some extent when we get to the section on psychic individuation, because he is going to talk about sensation there. But I think one key point here is that that there's a sensation has to do with a living individual. It's a relation. So he says sensation must appear as the relation of a living individual with the milieu in which it is found. Because of this relational quality of sensation, it's there's a sort of traditional epistemological doctrine, or not even a doctrine, but a current in epistemology that would tend to say that we can only ever have knowledge of the coordination of sensations or something along those lines. So we can when we do science, what we're doing is coming up with laws to predict future sensations or something like that. But what Simondon was criticizing in that doctrine, that account of the relationship between sensation and knowledge, or scientific knowledge in particular, is that it's presupposing that what sensation should do, or what we are seeking through sensation, is knowledge of a substantial individual or a substance, which would be ontologically distinct from the relations into which it enters. Whereas, as we've seen a number of times, Simondon wants to understand relation as having the status of being, so that in sensation there's if sensation is truly a relation, so if something that has the status of being, then we have to understand it as part of the process of individuation of the entire subject-object system, rather than as as like an effect on the subject or something like that. So that's sort of what's going on with the criticism of this account of sensation and its relation to knowledge.
Would you say that it also is related to the topological, like allegmatic distinction, or not distinction, that the topological and allegmatic notion of information that we discussed previously, and like as opposed to, because he brings up induction as well, which seems to bring up the problems with logic and analogy that we previously discussed. So like going in the direction of, if it's topological, then the informing of the surface states are not sort of like ancillary, but are part of sort of trying to understand the individual milieu relation itself. I might just be making words up here, but that's how I'm seeing it.
I think there's also maybe like a definition issue here. Empiricism as a word. If you look at it the way Deleuze looks at it, then it means something different, I think, than in the way that maybe Simondon is using it here. Because Deleuze would say, like, I think he says it in Empiricism and Subjectivity. It might be in Desert Islands and other texts, but he's like, no empiricist would like really say like the sensation of immediate experience is all there is. That's like nonsense. The point of experience, or of empiricism, is at the center. There's like a driving question of how does the subject arise in the given? Right. So empiricism does not believe in any form of transcendental or privileged viewpoint from which the subject arises, but that the subject is not given, but arises from within the given. Whereas, like, I think Simondon is using empiricism here specifically to mean kind of like the methodological, scientific, fact-gathering, everything is based in experience meaning of empiricism.
Yeah, I think that's right. That Deleuze is definitely using empiricism in a different way. So I think when Deleuze talks about empiricism, he's thinking of like the way that Hume will the way that Hume sort of depicts the formation of a personal of a subject out of the constructions from ideas and impressions and so on. So I think that's sort of what he has in mind, and he's less interested in empiricism as a doctrine of knowledge, whereas what Simondon was talking about is precisely about empiricism as a doctrine of knowledge. So that it has to do with the relationship between sensation and knowledge, and the way that that sensation is the sort of building block of knowledge for empiricism. So I think that's more what he has in mind when he talks about empiricism. But I think we should go on to the next subsection so we don't get just stuck on this. So if someone else could read the first page or so, I think it's one of these giant paragraphs again.
Subsection 3, Epistemological Consequences, Reality of Relation, and the Notion of Substance. What modification have we had to contribute to the conception of physical individuation by passing from the individuation of allotropic forms to the more fundamental individuation of the crystal with respect to the amorphous substance? The idea that individuation consists in an operation has remained unmodified, but we have been able to specify that the relation that this operation establishes can sometimes be currently operative and sometimes in suspense, thereby assuming all the apparent characteristics of substantial stability. Here, relation is observable as an active limit, and its type of reality is that of a limit. In this sense, we can define the individual as a limited being, but only on condition of thereby understanding that a limited being is a polarizing being that possesses an indefinite dynamism of growth with respect to an amorphous milieu. The individual is not substance, for substance is not limited by anything other than itself. This is what leads Spinoza to conceive substance as infinite and unique. Every rigorous substantialism excludes the notion of the individual, as we can see in Descartes, who could not explain to Princess Elizabeth in what the union of the substances in man consists, and even more so in Spinoza, who considers the individual as a semblance. The finite being is the exact contrary of the limited being, for the finite being is self-limiting, since it does not possess a sufficient quantity of being to grow endlessly. On the contrary, in this indefinite being that the individual is, the dynamism of growing does not stop, since the successive stages of growing are like a number of relays due to which increasingly large quantities of potential energy are captured in order to organize and incorporate increasingly considerable amounts of amorphous matter. Thus, relative to the initial germ, crystals visible to the naked eye are already considerable edifices. A cubic micrometer of diamond contains more than 177 billion atoms of carbon. It can therefore be thought that the crystalline germ has enlarged enormously when it attains the size of a crystal that is visible at the limit of the separative power of optical microscopes. But it is also known that it is possible to nourish an artificial crystal in a supersaturated solution quite carefully maintained in conditions of slow growth so as to obtain a crystalline individual weighing several kilograms. In this case, even if it were supposed that the crystalline germ is already an edifice of large dimensions relative to the atoms of which it is composed, we would find that the volume of a cubic decimeter has a mass 1 quadrillion times superior to that of a supposed crystalline germ at 1 cubic micrometer of volume. Crystals of an ordinary size, which almost constitute the totality of the terrestrial surface, like those of quartz, feldspar, and mica, which make up the composition of granite, have a mass equal to several million times that of their germ. I'll just read this next sentence because I think it follows. I don't know. Thus, it is completely necessary to suppose the existence of a feedback mechanism that allows for the extremely small amount of energy contained in the germ's limit to structure a rather considerable massive amorphous substance.
Yeah, we can stop there for now. Yeah, again, this is sort of an arbitrary cutoff point because this is one giant paragraph like he likes to give us. But yeah, let's stop there. And so one key point of this bit that we just read is he specified what the difference is between the relative notion of individuation and the absolute notion of individuation. So individuation proceeding from something already individuated, so the one crystal form recrystallizing into the other, as opposed to, in this case, the amorphous substance crystallizing for the first time. And so one of the key differences is that looking at the absolute notion of individuation, we can see that it has a capacity to be suspended or and to give, as he says, the appearance of substantial stability. So that so this is where we have our notion of metastability, where we have something that is something created, something that is a result of a process, but that also has the capacity to further that process or to continue that process in the future under the right conditions. So here, then he goes on to specify this as being the limit of the crystal, so that, and when we saw some discussion of this last time, I think, but the crystal forms by accretion at the limit of the germ. So you have one layer of molecules around the germ, and then that layer crystallizes, and then the next layer around the first layer crystallizes, and then and so on until the entire amorphous substance is crystallized. So that the limit of the crystal is both a product of the individuation process, and it's also plays the role of the germ for the next stage of the crystallization process. So the actual energy that you introduce into the system by introducing the germ is very small, but it sort of subordinates the potential energy contained in the amorphous substance, so that it carries out the work of crystallization, of structuration. And as he points out, this tiny germ can bring about the crystallization of many millions of times more amorphous substance than is contained in that germ.
One thing that this section made me think of is, I think early on, I think it was All Dreams who pointed out that there was a kind of a problem or an ambiguity with Simondon needing to presuppose the germ for the process of individuation. But at least it's not the case that he's presupposing some kind of, like an atom, which is like infinitely self-identical, but the individual that starts the process of individuation is itself kind of frozen relation from another process of individuation, which maybe doesn't solve the problem, but I think makes it a little bit more complex and interesting, I guess.
Yeah, there's a bit. This is I think a sort of a recurring problem that we've discussed a few times as it came up. But there's a bit. I think I'm not sure if it's in this subsection or the next one that I was just reading today, but where he talks about how the formation of these germs, these crystalline germs, is still mysterious. So where like when you start from an amorphous substance, the germs appear sort of spontaneously, and how how they appear and what the conditions are for that appearance is sort of mysterious. And so I think to some extent it might not be a very satisfying answer, but we could just say that the point in Simondon's system that is left unexplained is because just empirically we don't have or at the time he was writing at least, we didn't have knowledge of how that process works. And it would be interesting to look at to see whether that's changed in the 50, 60 years since he was writing. Whether there has been more a better account of the formation of those crystalline germs. That's something I don't know, but would be worth investigating, I think.
Well, for me, a question here is over the meaning of this absolute individuation. I'm wondering in what sense he means it as absolute. So he's saying it's the individuation from the amorphous substance into a crystal. But I guess what I'm wondering is if for Simondon if it's possible to ever say, there is an amorphous solution at some point and nothing else, and then we ask, well, how did it all get started? How did the first transfer from amorphous into a structured crystal happen? And I wonder if he might say, well, actually, that question is not really valid because it's presupposing a kind of separation of the two that's artificial, or a kind of breaking up of the. I guess what I'm wondering is, could it be that what's basic and fundamental is the very relation of becoming? And so there was never a state in which it was just a amorphous solution, and we had to explain how did the first germ, where did the first germ come from? And maybe it's a kind of I don't know, like almost like an eternal recurrence of the individuation process. Like it's ontogenesis all the way down. I mean, that might be one way of resolving that issue, right? Like, becoming is really all there is. And then in some instances, we get substances that seem relatively stable, but that's derivative, right? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that would be one, I guess, approach to try to answer this question, or to more like to dissolve the question, I guess, to make us not feel like we need to answer that question anymore. The reason I'm sort of hesitant to take that approach, or to fully accept that approach, is that in the introduction, and then again in the conclusion once we come to it, he does talk about something like a dephasing of being, where we seem to start with something like being as a pre-individual, something analogous to that amorphous substance, and then there's a splitting of that being into the different phases. So it does seem as if the bigger picture, at the level of ontology, he wants to maintain something like a pre-individual being, or an amorphous substance as the first moment, or a first term, which then undergoes splitting, and the process of individuation would be secondary to that splitting. And so insofar as the pre-individual being is something like a first moment, then it does still leave that question open of where the structural germ comes in, or arises from. But I think we can go on to the next bit. So another page or so of this multi-page paragraph. If someone else would like to read.
In fact, the limit of the crystal is the germ during growth. and this limit is displaced to the degree that the crystal grows. It is composed of atoms that are always new, but it remains dynamically identical to itself and grows on the surface by conserving the same local characteristics of growth. This primordial role of the limit is particularly highlighted by phenomena such as figures of corrosion and especially of epitaxy, which constitute a remarkable counterproof. Figures of corrosion, which are obtained in the assault of a crystal by a reagent, manifest tiny depressions with regular contours that could be called negative crystals. However, these negative crystals have a different form depending on the facet of the crystal on which they appear. Fluorine can be attacked by sulfuric acid, yet fluorine crystallizes in the form of cubes, which, when struck, yield facets parallel to those of the regular octahedron. Through corrosion, quadrangular pyramids can be seen to appear on the facet of the cube, while little triangular pyramids appear on the facet of the octahedron. All the figures that appear on the same facet have the same orientation. Epitaxy is a phenomenon that occurs when a crystal is taken as a support of a substance during crystallization. Nascent crystals are oriented by the crystalline facet of a different chemical substance on which they are placed. The crystal's asymmetry or dissymmetry appears in these two phenomena. Thus, when calcite and dolomite, Cl3Ca and Cl3,2Camg, are attacked by diluted nitric acid, calcite presents symmetrical figures of corrosion on a facet of cleavage, while dolomite presents dissymmetrical figures. These examples show that the characteristics of the limit of the physical individual can appear in each point of the individual, thereby again becoming a limit. For example, here, through cleavage. The individual can therefore play a role of information and end up, even locally, as an active singularity capable of polarizing.
Yeah, we can stop here for now. It's just worth noting that that paragraph break is added in the translation, and there's no break in the French. So I don't know why exactly. I mean, it's fine to break up the paragraph, I guess, but I don't think he's done that before in other big paragraphs. So that's kind of strange.
Doesn't this kind of speak to what we were just saying, though? Why I was inclined to agree with what Aldreams was saying of like, there is this very, like, not to always bang on that train, but this Bergsonian sense of starting from an idea of a negation or of the negative, less than, what supposedly comes after it is problematic. And in this case, he's talking about, like, I love at the end of this paragraph where he says the individual can play the role of information and end up itself kind of as an active singularity. That I could be wrong, but it strikes me like when he's talking about things like, because there is a point where there is dephasing hasn't occurred yet, as he's discussed, but to me that almost seems like a methodological conceit, the way that Bergson would talk about pure memory or pure perception, sort of like we need to establish those limits in order to understand the actually mixed state that things are always becoming in. And I guess I was thinking, along these lines of one individual can end up becoming the singularity for another individual, that we arrive, like, through transduction and through these processes. It's as though we can arrive at what seems like this originary moment, but we have to remember that we didn't start from there. So, like, by arriving at that point of what appears to be where dephasing hasn't yet occurred, it's as though that is an origin point, but that we only reached that, genealogically backwards, right? At least that's how I understand the method. So it's not that we're actually proceeding from there. It's just that we've reached what appears to be kind of like the deepest point we can in order to, like, discuss ontogenesis. But at any point, I mean, in theory, couldn't this principle apply that, that individual or that point of seeming, I don't know what the word is, of wherever you see substance or that amorphous substance, it could just be a previous support, I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't know if that's correct, but that's kind of how I was reading that.
I wonder if maybe the question we're up against is about the unity of being and becoming, and what such a unity can mean. Because I guess there's two positions that it seems to me Simondon is not, it's not what he's doing. On the one hand, privileging being over becoming, it's very clear, he is against that position. But then there's another position where you can privilege becoming over being, right? And I guess my hunch is that he's not doing that either. He seems to want some kind of, maybe a mediation or a unity of being and becoming. So, I don't think it's, he's clearly not just this kind of philosopher of constant change and, chaos, and, that's that. And I'm not saying, Alosha, that that's what you're pointing at, but I guess it seems like something about, like, even in the process of ontogenesis, we still want to discern being there, right? And that might lead down this road towards that original state of the prior to the dephasing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I think that's the relationship between being and becoming. I think you're right that he doesn't want to sort of completely subordinate being to becoming, which would be maybe a sort of I don't know, a pop Bergsonian approach or something like that. Everything is becoming and being is an illusion or something like that. But I think, I think you're right that he wants to find some sort of mediating concept between being and becoming, and I think that's what the notion of transduction is supposed to do. It's a kind of mediation between the two. So I think that might be. I think you might be right that the problem of that initial pre-individual being sort of recurs at that level of the dialectic. But I think we can go on to the next bit, which is continuing this big paragraph, and we won't really see. It's only towards the end of this paragraph that we see more of the why he's bringing up all these examples, like these negative crystals and so on. So we have to sort of stay tuned for that. Nevertheless, we can wonder whether these properties, particularly the property of homogeneity, as we shall note, can still exist on the very small scale. Is there an inferior limit of this crystalline individuation? In 1784, Ivy formulated the reticular theory of crystals, and this was confirmed in 1912 by Laue due to the discovery of the diffraction of X-rays by crystals, which behave as a network. Ivy studied calcite, which presents itself in extremely various forms. He discovered that all the crystals of calcite, through cleavage, can yield the same rhombohedron, which is a parallelepiped whose 6 facets are equal diamond shapes and form together an angle of 105 degrees 5 minutes. Through the phenomenon of parting, we can make these rhombohedrons increasingly small and visible only through a microscope, but the form does not change. Ivy supposed a limit to these successive divisions, and he imagined the crystals of calcite as stacks of these elementary rhombohedrons. With Laue's method, it became possible to measure with X-rays the dimensions of this elementary rhombohedron, whose height is equal to 3.029 by 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. Halite, which has 3 rectangular cleavages, consists of indivisible elementary cubes, whose ultimate measure is 5.628 by 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. We can therefore consider a halite crystal as constituted by material particles, molecules of sodium chloride, arranged in the nodes of a crystalline network constituted by three sets of reticular planes intersecting at a right angle. The elementary cube is called the crystalline lattice. Calcite will be constituted by three systems of reticular planes, which together form an angle of 105 degrees 5 minutes and are each separated by the constant interval of 3.029 by 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. Each crystal can be considered as constituted by a network of parallelepipeds. This reticular structure not only accounts for the stratification parallel to the cleaves, but even more so for the various modes of stratification. Thus, in the cubic network, which explains the structure of halite, we can observe a stratification parallel to the diagonals of the cube. This stratification appears in zinc sulfide. The nodes of the cubic network can be arranged in reticular planes parallel to the facets of the regular octahedron. Above, we have seen the cleavage of fluorite, which corresponds to such a stratification. We ought to contemplate this notion of multiple stratification particularly, for it gives both an intelligible and a real content to the idea of limit. The limit is constitutive when it is no longer the material boundary of a being, but is its structure, constituted by the ensemble of points, which are analogous to any other point of the crystalline milieu. The crystalline milieu is a periodic milieu. To know the crystalline milieu completely, all we need to know is the content of the crystalline elementary lattice, i.e. the position of the different atoms. By submitting the latter to translations according to the three axes of coordinates, we will find all the analogous points that correspond to them in the milieu. The crystalline milieu is a triply periodic milieu whose period is defined by the lattice parameters. According to Jean Viard, we can compose an image, at least in the plane, of the crystal's periodicity by comparing it to the indefinitely repeated motif of a wallpaper. Viard also adds, we also find this motif in all of the nodes of a network of parallelograms. Just like the crystal's elementary lattice, the sides of the elementary parallelogram do not have any existence. Thus, the limit is not predetermined. It consists in structuration. The moment that an arbitrary point is chosen in this triply periodic milieu, both the elementary lattice and the set of spatial limits are determined. In fact, the shared source of the limit and the structuration is the milieu's periodicity. Here, with a more rational content, we rediscover the already indicated notion of the indefinite possibility of growth. The crystal can grow while conserving all of its characteristics because it possesses a periodic structure. The growth is therefore always identical to itself. A crystal has no center that allows us to measure the distance of one point of its exterior contour with respect to its center. Relative to the crystal structure, its limit is no more distant from the center than the other points. The crystal's limit is in virtually every point, and it can really appear in each point through a cleavage. The words interiority and exteriority cannot be applied with their usual meaning to this reality that the crystal is. On the contrary, let's consider an amorphous substance. It must be bounded by a membrane, and its surface can have properties that belong exclusively to the surface. Thus, a drop of water produced by a water dropper takes on, during its formation, a certain number of successive aspects that can be studied by mechanics. These aspects depend on the diameter of the tube, the force of attraction due to gravity, and the superficial tension of the liquid. Here, the phenomenon is extremely variable according to the order of magnitude adopted, since the envelope acts as an envelope and not as a limit. Furthermore, let us indeed remark that amorphous bodies can in certain cases take on regular forms, like that of mist formed by drops of water. But we cannot speak of the individuation of a water drop like we speak of the individuation of the crystal, because the former does not possess a periodic structure, at least not rigorously and in the totality of its mass. A drop of water with large dimensions is not exactly identical for all its properties to a drop of water with small dimensions. So here he is contrasting the individuation of a crystal with the unindividuated, what we can maybe call like a quasi-individual, such as a drop of water, so that in the case of the drop of water, it doesn't form in the same way so that it has a homogeneous structure throughout. There's a functional differentiation between the surface and the interior, and drops of water of different sizes will have a different form because of the effect of gravity and so on. But there's no sort of internal structuration of the drop of water so that it will have a homogeneous structure throughout, whereas in the case of the crystal, the crystal has the same structure throughout, and so there's each portion of the crystal can play the role of the limit and serve as the germ for a new layer of individuation if it's broken off or something like that. Yeah, and then the question, Alio, so you had it in the chat there. Yeah, the periodic here just means the repeating crystalline structure, so that if you take a crystal with a cubical structure, for example, and you just move every atom one cube to the right or one cube up or whatever, then you end up with a crystal that has the same structure. So that the structure of the cube is it repeats over these tiny cubes of whatever 3.029 3.029 by 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. So that's what the periodic means there. And then the question, what exactly what it means to describe something as an amorphous body. I don't think the having the surface is a necessary property of an amorphous. Well, actually, he does say it must be bounded by a membrane. I think when we talk about a membrane, though, that has to do with the relationship between water and another substance like air, the surrounding air. So I think, I guess the clay or something like that is would have a membrane as well. I'm not sure if that's correct. From a physical point of view, that would be something. It would be helpful to have someone who could confirm or deny that. Whether we can describe clay as having a membrane in the same way that water does.
Well, I don't know if the surface thing is, but I mean, certainly clay example seem to apply, right? Because of isn't the whole point of the homogeneity within it? So the homogeneity allows it to sort of be formed by the singularity and whatnot. I'm just trying to understand the terms because I found this section really helpful, but I'm still trying to grasp amorphous substance, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure that the clay example fits here because I'm not sure about the membrane part. But there are other cases that he mentions earlier when he's talking about like the way that sulfur, for example, can be in an amorphous state, and then it can crystallize in two different crystalline structures. So we can have an amorphous state of sulfur, and most substances, I think, can have an amorphous state, which can then be crystallized in some substances. But then there's also something like, I guess glass would be an example of something that doesn't have a crystalline state, so that it has a vitreous state, which isn't properly, it's still amorphous, so it's not glass is not an individual in the proper sense for Simondon.
Can I ask a quick question before we go on?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm just curious. I was just flipping back through the text. I'm wondering to what extent this repeatable, this periodic structure that he's talking about here, I'm wondering how much it relates to the material condition that had come up earlier. I think we talked about it last time. Like the third element. I think he called it a kind of compatibility between energy and the germ. That, like he said, not every germ can individualize every amorphous field. And there's got to be some third kind of affinity or, I think, analogy he used. And I'm curious if this periodic structure here relates to that. And it may be an elaboration of that idea, or if we're talking about something different.
So the periodic structure in the crystal, as a product or as a result of the process of individuation, would be would be the product of well, I think, I'm just trying to think. It might be. I think it would be wrong to say that it's a product only of the material condition or something like that. In the example of the sulfur or these other substances that have allotropic forms shows that both the germ, the structuring condition, and the nature, the chemical nature of the substance in the amorphous stage, both of them contribute towards the structure that will result. So I think we'd have to say that the periodic structure in the crystal as a result is the product of all three conditions. So the structuring condition, the material condition, and the energetic condition all together. I don't think we can attribute it to one condition in particular.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is, that makes sense. What I'm thinking is, I guess I'm inclined to think of that material condition, which is still kind of mystifying to me what it is, as a kind of virtual, what does he call it here? Sorry. He calls it a kind of a motif of a wallpaper, like a virtual periodicity, basically. A kind of virtual structuration that makes a milieu amenable to certain germs, but not to others. And in that sense, this seems related, but it's hard to say. I guess he hasn't really given much of an explanation of that middle term or the material condition yet.
I think the material condition would just be the chemical nature of the substance in question, and that's what determines the compatibility between a germ, the structural condition, and the energetic condition. So the in the case of this crystallization example, like the temperature of the system as a whole. And so the material condition is just the chemical nature of the substance, which will determine whether a particular germ is compatible with a particular energetic condition in order to produce an individuating process. So I think that's at least how I understand the material condition. So it plays the role of mediating or making compatible, as you pointed out. But I think it's just we can identify it with the chemical nature of the substance. But yeah, we can continue. Angus has been patiently waiting to read the next bit. So we're at the bottom of page 91.
The individuation that we will characterize through the example of the crystal cannot exist without an elementary discontinuity on a more restricted scale. It takes an edifice of atoms to constitute a crystalline lattice, and this structuration would be very difficult to conceive without an elementary discontinuity. It's true that when Descartes wanted to explain all physical effects through figure and movement, he sought to found the existence of forms on something other than elementary discontinuity, which was inconceivable in a system where an absolute vacuum is excluded, insofar as extension is substantialized and becomes res extensa. Thus, Descartes also considered crystals quite carefully, and he even attentively observed the genesis of artificial crystals in a supersaturated solution of sea salt by attempting to explain it through figure and movement. But Descartes experiences great difficulty in discovering the foundation of structures. At the beginning of Meteors, he strives to show a genesis of spatial boundaries, starting from the opposition of the direction of the rotation of two neighboring vortices. Movement is what primordially individuates regions of space. In a mechanics without live forces, movement indeed can seem to be a purely geometrical determination. But movement by itself in a matter-space continuum cannot easily constitute an anisotropy of physical properties. That Descartes' attempt made to explain the magnetic field through figure and movement, starting from spirals generated by the poles of the magnet and pivoting around themselves, remains unfruitful. We can indeed use this hypothesis to explain how two poles of the same name repel one another, or how two poles of contrary names attract one another. We cannot explain the coexistence of these two properties because this coexistence requires an anisotropy, whereas Descartes' space matter is isotropic. Substantialism can only explain phenomena of isotropy. Polarization, the most elementary condition of relation, remains incomprehensible in a rigorous substantialism. Thus, Descartes also strives to explain all the phenomena in which a field manifests vectorial magnitudes via the mechanism of subtle matter. He devoted a lot of attention to crystals because they presented him with a clear illustration of the reality of figures. They are substantialized geometrical forms. But since his system excludes the vacuum, Descartes' system made it impossible to recognize what is fundamental in the crystalline state, namely the genetic individuation of periodic and therefore discontinuous structure, which is opposed to the continuous or to the disorder of the amorphous state. However, to be fully rigorous, we should not claim that if the crystalline state is discontinuous, then the amorphous state is continuous. In fact, the same substance can present itself in the amorphous state or in the crystalline state without a modification of its elementary particles. But even if it is composed of discontinuous elements like molecules, a substance can behave as continuous from the moment that enough elementary particles are implicated in the production of the phenomenon. Indeed, a multitude of disorganized actions, i.e. those that obey neither a polarization nor a periodic distribution in time, have average sums that are distributed in an isotropic field. These include, for example, the pressures in a compressed gas. The example of Brownian motion, which sheds light on the thermal agitation of large molecules, also illustrates this condition of isotropic milieus. If, in order to observe this movement, we consider increasingly large visible particles, the movements of these particles end up becoming imperceptible. This is because the instantaneous sum of the energies received on each facet of the portion of molecules in a state of agitation is increasingly low with respect to the mass of the observable particle. The more voluminous the particle, the more elevated the number of collisions on each facet per unit of time. Since the distribution of these collisions occurs at random, the forces per unit of surface are more constant in time as the surfaces considered are increasingly large, and an observable particle that is voluminous enough remains practically at rest. For sufficient durations and orders of dimension, the disorganized discontinuous is equivalent to the continuous. It is functionally continuous. The discontinuous can therefore manifest sometimes as continuous and sometimes as discontinuous according to whether it is organized or disorganized. But the continuous cannot functionally present itself as discontinuous since it is isotropic.
Right, so we had here some discussion of Descartes' system of physics, which, as Simondo mentions here, is a system that has no void. So space and matter are identical, and the the problem in general with that system is that there's no way to explain anisotropy, so that if space and matter are identical and they're just this homogeneous space matter substance, the extended thing, then it becomes impossible to explain how there's something like a polarization or a differentiation of directions within that space matter. and the example of the magnets. So Descartes tries to explain the magnets by these spirals of subtle matter, which would be either go in a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction. But as Simondon points out, that you need a clockwise spiral for either attraction or repulsion. I can't remember which one, but you need a clockwise spiral for one direction of motion, and then you need a counterclockwise spiral for the other direction of motion of magnets, so that it's impossible to have both attraction of opposite poles of the magnet and repulsion of same poles of the magnet using these spirals of subtle matter. So that this is sort of a symptom that Simondon is identifying of the incapacity of substantialism to explain anisotropy or polarization or differentiation of direction. Yeah, so this is directed at Descartes' system in particular, but more generally at any system that would want to begin with something like a pure substance or something substantial that has the pre-given quality of individuation that isn't the result of a genesis. And then he goes on to talk about the relationship between the continuous and the discontinuous, and we'll see more about this in the next chapter as well. What he argues here is that the discontinuous is more fundamental than the continuous, because through the action of probabilistic interaction, so large numbers of discontinuous actions can approximate the continuous and can therefore give the effect of an isotropic milieu, but the continuous can't produce the effect of the discontinuous. So the discontinuous is more fundamental for that reason, because it can give the effect of the continuous, but not the other way around. Yeah, as Alyosha mentioned, there's going to be a discussion of, as I said, there's more discussion of this relationship between the discontinuous and the continuous in the next chapter, and he is going to make a link between discontinuity and the role of relation as a status of being. We're going to see more discussion of quantum mechanics because that is based on a fundamentally discontinuous understanding of the physical world, and we'll see more on that in the next chapter. Okay, we can go on to the next bit. I can read. I think this will take us to the end of the section. I'll read the next bit. Continuing down this path, we shall find that the aspect of continuity can present itself as a particular case of discontinuous reality, whereas the reciprocal of this proposition is not true. The discontinuous is first with respect to the continuous. This is why the study of individuation, which grasps the discontinuous qua discontinuous, has a very profound ontological and epistemological value. It invites us to ask how ontogenesis is accomplished based on a system bearing energetic potentials and structural germs. There's individuation not of a substance, but of a system, and this individuation is what generates what we call substance, starting from an initial singularity. Nevertheless, to arrive at an ontological primacy of the individual from these remarks would be to lose sight of the full nature of the fruitfulness of relation. The physical individual that is the crystal is a periodic structured being that results from a genesis in which a structural condition and a hylomorphic condition containing matter and energy encounter one another in a relation of compatibility. However, in order for the possibility of energy to be captured by a structure, it would have to be given in a potential form, i.e. distributed in an initially non-polarized milieu behaving as a continuum. The genesis of the individual requires the discontinuous of the structural germ and the functional continuum of the preliminary amorphous milieu. A potential energy, which is measurable by a scalar magnitude, can be captured by a structure, a bundle of polarities that can be represented vectorially. The genesis of the individual is effectuated by the relation of these vectoral magnitudes and these scalar magnitudes. It is therefore unnecessary to replace substantialism with a monism of the constituted individual. A monadological pluralism would still be a substantialism. However, every substantialism is a monism, whether unified or diversified, in the sense that it merely retains one of the two aspects of being, terms without operative relation. The physical individual integrates in its genesis the mutual operation of the continuous and the discontinuous, and its existence is the becoming of this ongoing genesis, prolonged in activity or in waiting. This supposes that individuation exists on an intermediate level between the order of magnitude of the particulate elements and that of the molar ensemble of the complete system. On this intermediate level, individuation is an operation of amplifying structuration that makes the active properties of the initially microphysical discontinuity pass to the macrophysical level. Individuation is initiated on the level at which the discontinuous of the singular molecule is capable, in a milieu, in a hylomorphic situation of metastability, of modulating an energy whose support is already a part of the continuum in the population of randomly arranged molecules, i.e. in a superior order of magnitude relative to the molar system. The polarizing singularity initiates in the amorphous milieu a cumulative structuration that spans the initially separated orders of magnitude. The singularity, or information, is that in which there is communication between orders of magnitude. As the initiator of the individual, it is conserved in the latter. So we have this priority of the discontinuous over the continuous, but we shouldn't understand that in terms of a priority of already constituted individuals. So we need to understand the discontinuous as not as made up of already constituted individuals, which is something that we'll see more in the next chapter, how we can do that. So as he says, if we conceive of the discontinuous as being made up of individuals, or if we take this priority of the discontinuous to mean that already constituted individuals have ontological priority, then we end up with basically just the same substantialism, just divided up into little bits or something like that. So it's we still have no substantialism is still a monism, as he puts it, because it's only grasping being insofar as it's individuated, and it doesn't grasp the other side of being, which is the relation side of being, or the pre-individual side of being. And so, so we'll see in the next chapter how we can try to understand the discontinuous, this ontologically fundamental discontinuous, without taking it to be an already constituted individual. And one sort of a small note, but we've discussed the last couple of weeks how he seems to alternate between talking about 3 conditions of individuation and 2 conditions, where he identifies 2 of them as one condition. And so here he talks about 2 conditions. So he says, a genesis in which a structural condition and a hylomorphic condition containing matter and energy encounter one another in a relation of compatibility. So he puts the material condition and the energetic condition together as one hylomorphic condition in this case here, whereas in other cases he separates those 2 out, and he gives a list of 3 conditions. So I'm not sure if there's a deeper reason for this alternation, like why he goes back and forth between the 2, but it would be interesting to try to figure that out. So if there are no other comments or questions, maybe we can wrap up a little bit early today, because we're at the end of the chapter, and then we can start chapter 3 next time, if that's okay with everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and contributions, and I'll see you all next week, and we'll start chapter 3.